There is a fundamental assumption in the annals of criminal history that children, particularly 12-year-old girls, are incapable of the sustained, cold-blooded architectural planning required for serial murder. We assume that the young lack the patience for long games, the emotional detachment to watch life extinguish without trembling, and the anatomical knowledge to make homicide look like mere misfortune. Yet, in the humid, clay-dusted expanse of Burke County, Georgia, this assumption was violently dismantled, beginning in the spring of 1851. Over a span of nearly 4 years, 17 men met their ends on 3 distinct cotton plantations. These were not men of weak constitution. They were overseers, drivers, and supervisors, men who wielded whips and authority with equal weight. The local medical examiners, baffled by the statistical anomaly of so many accidental deaths, signed death certificates citing drowning, falls, kicks from horses, and sudden illness. The sheriff, a man named Clayton Morgan, consistently closed the files, unable to find a single shred of physical evidence linking the deaths to human agency. They never suspected that 2 identical faces, devoid of fear or remorse, were watching from the periphery, tallying the dead on a silent internal ledger that balanced blood with blood. To understand the carnage, one must first understand the stage upon which it was set. Hutchkins Fields was not merely a farm, it was a sprawling 800-acre industrial engine of the Antebellum South, located a dozen miles south of Waynesboro. In 1851, it was in the throes of its most lucrative season in a decade, a white ocean of cotton managed by William Hutchkins. Hutchkins was a man of ledgers and ink, a deacon who believed that godliness was found in order and profit. He tracked every variable of his estate with obsessive precision: the weight of the harvest, the cost of grain, the depreciation of tools, and the vital statistics of the 347 enslaved souls he claimed as property. His study was lined with leather-bound volumes, a library of human misery reduced to arithmetic. His wife, Elena, mirrored his cold efficiency in the domestic sphere, ruling the household staff with a quiet, terrifying rigor. It was into this world of rigid hierarchy and carefully monitored lines of sight that Sarah and Margaret arrived, purchased in January of that year from a passing trader in Augusta. They were listed simply as twin females, approx. 12, domestic, with no surname and no recorded kin, effectively blanks in the historical record waiting to be filled. The twins entered Hutchkins Fields on a grey Tuesday afternoon, huddled in the back of a transport wagon alongside 7 other strangers. Even then, amidst the confusion and trauma of arrival, they possessed a disquieting stillness. Robert Thaddeus Crane, the plantation's head overseer, processed them with the bureaucratic indifference of a man who had spent 6 years turning humans into labor units. Crane was a formidable figure, built of muscle and scar tissue, known for a discipline that was absolute but rarely theatrical. He assigned the girls to the kitchen and laundry details under the supervision of his wife, Martha. In those initial weeks, the twins were nothing short of phantoms. They spoke only when a direct question required an answer, and even then their voices were flat, uncolored by the fear that usually defined new arrivals. They moved with a synchronization that unnerved the older women in the laundry. If Sarah reached for a basket, Margaret was already opening the door. They were 2 halves of a single consciousness, observing the plantation's machinery with eyes that seemed to be deconstructing the very physics of their prison. While the other enslaved workers kept their heads down to avoid the lash, Sarah and Margaret watched the overseers with the focus of predators studying migration patterns. They memorized the rotation of the guards, the blind spots behind the stables, the specific times when men were isolated, and the varying temperaments of those in power. They did not look for escape routes, they looked for leverage. Their attention eventually settled on Vernon Cushing, the overseer of the East Cotton Fields. Cushing was a 28-year-old sadist who viewed pain not as a tool for discipline, but as a recreational pastime. He targeted the vulnerable, women, the elderly, children, with a glee that even Robert Crane found distasteful. The twins observed Cushing for 3 weeks, cataloguing his movements with scientific detachment. They noted that every morning, 15 minutes after the dawn bell, Cushing rode his stallion along a narrow, muddy track through a pine thicket to reach the fields. He always rode alone, and he always rode fast, confident in his dominion over the land and its people. The morning of March 28, 1851, brought a torrential downpour that turned the Georgia clay into a slick, treacherous paste. It was the variable the twins had been waiting for. Under the cover of a pre-dawn sky that was still bruised with storm clouds, Sarah and Margaret slipped from the kitchen quarters. They carried a length of hemp rope stolen from the stables days prior. They moved to a section of the pine path where two ancient trees created a natural choke point and where the rain had pooled into a deep, muddy depression. Working with practiced efficiency, they tied the rope between the trees at shin height, too low for a rider to see in the gloom, but perfectly placed to intercept the galloping legs of a horse. They did not linger to admire their handiwork. They retreated 20 yards into the brush, silent and invisible, to wait for the physics of momentum to do their work. When Cushing came thundering down the path, his horse hit the tripwire and somersaulted forward, the violence of the stop ejecting the overseer face first into the mud. The impact was catastrophic. Cushing landed with such force that the wind was driven instantly from his lungs, leaving him gasping in a slurry of water and earth. Before he could recover, his panicked horse, thrashing to regain its footing, rolled partially over him, pinning him into the muck. By the time the field hands discovered him an hour later, Vernon Cushing had drowned in 8 inches of dirty water, his mouth and nose packed with the soil he had once ruled over. The twins had retrieved their rope and were back in the kitchen, their hands dusted with flour, long before the alarm was raised. The sheriff from Waynesboro conducted a perfunctory examination, concluding that the horse had slipped in the treacherous mud, a simple misadventure. No one questioned the narrative. Why would they? Men died on plantations all the time. As Cushing was lowered into the earth behind the Baptist church, life at Hutchkins Fields resumed its rhythm, but the twins had learned a vital lesson. Murder, when dressed as an accident, is invisible to the eyes of the powerful. With Cushing gone, the plantation's ecosystem shifted. William Hutchkins promoted Douglas Pritchard, a 40-year-old career supervisor, to fill the vacancy. Pritchard was a man of average cruelty, a bureaucrat of violence who did what was necessary to maintain quotas. He might have survived his tenure if not for a single afternoon in April. The twins watched as Pritchard beat an elderly man named Samuel with a shovel handle because the old man, delirious with fever, moved too slowly. Pritchard didn't just strike him, he kicked the collapsed man with a casual disregard that sealed his fate. That night, lying in the darkness of the kitchen quarters, Sarah and Margaret silently added Pritchard to their ledger. Pritchard's routine was different. He commuted from town and kept his saddle in the plantation tack room. The twins, who had access to the stables to feed kitchen scraps to the pigs, began to study his equipment. They ignored the obvious weapons, knives or pitchforks, and focused instead on the structural integrity of his leather gear. On the evening of April 29th, the twins infiltrated the tack room while the stable hand was distracted. They did not slash Pritchard's equipment. Destruction would be obvious. Instead, Sarah used a shard of glass sharpened on a river stone to perform a delicate surgery on the girth strap, the thick band that holds the saddle to the horse. She made a series of deep, longitudinal scores on the underside of the leather, hidden from casual inspection. The cuts were designed to hold against a steady pull, but to shear completely under the sudden, violent stress of a horse bolting or a rider jerking the reins. It was a time bomb made of leather. The next morning, Pritchard saddled his horse, the strap holding firm, and rode out to the fields. For hours the leather held, groaning under the microscopic expansion of the cuts. It wasn't until mid-morning, when his horse shied violently at a snake, that the trap sprung. The sudden lateral force snapped the compromised leather with the sound of a pistol shot. Pritchard was an experienced rider, but no amount of skill can compensate for a saddle that suddenly rotates 90 degrees. He was thrown sideways, his left foot hopelessly snarled in the stirrup iron. The horse, terrified by the saddle slipping under its belly, bolted blindly through the cotton rows. Pritchard was dragged for 40 yards, his body battering against the hardened earth and cotton stalks until laborers managed to intercept the animal. He was carried to the infirmary with a fractured skull and crushed ribs, lingering in agony for 3 hours before dying. The official verdict was equipment failure, a tragedy caused by old, dry, rotted leather. William Hutchkins inspected the strap himself, shaking his head at the frayed edges, never seeing the precise glass cuts hidden within the tear. That night, as the plantation whispered news of the second death in 2 months, Sarah leaned over to Margaret in the dark and whispered a single word: 3. They had killed 2 men, and they were just beginning. The summer of 1851 descended upon Burke County like a heavy woolen blanket, a suffocating heat that made the air shimmer above the cotton rows and turned the interior of the processing buildings into stifling ovens. It was in this atmosphere of sweat and mechanical noise that the twins turned their gaze toward their third target. Harold Simmons was the supervisor of the cotton gin operation, a 34-year-old technocrat who valued the efficiency of the machine over the safety of the men who fed it. Simmons was not merely strict. He was a man who used a heavy leather quirt to correct errors in feeding the hoppers, leaving welts on backs that stung with the salt of sweat. He spent his days inside the gin house, a cavernous wooden cathedral dedicated to the separation of fiber from seed. The air inside was perpetually thick with white lint, creating a localized snowstorm that coated lungs and skin alike. The heart of the building was the main drive belt, a massive, slapping loop of leather that transferred power from the external water wheel to the internal gears. It moved at 8 feet per second, a blur of kinetic energy that Simmons often stood dangerously close to during his inspections. The twins, assigned to bring water to the gin crews, had mapped the interior of the building with the same predatory geometry they had applied to the fields. They understood the relationship between the external power source and the internal violence of the gears. On June 14th, during the afternoon shift change, when the great wheel was briefly disengaged, Sarah and Margaret entered the silent building. They carried their water buckets, rendering them invisible to the few workers lingering by the doors. While Margaret distracted Simmons with a question about the grading of the fiber, a calculated anomaly as the twins never spoke, Sarah moved toward the main drive shaft. She worked with terrifying speed, retrieving a length of thin, high-tensile cord she had submerged in her water bucket. She tied one end to a structural support beam and left the other end dangling, forming a subtle loop mere inches from where the drive belt would traverse once the machinery roared back to life. It was a trap based not on direct violence, but on entanglement. When the shift whistle blew and the external wheel groaned into motion, the gin house awoke with a deafening cacophony of creaks and clatter. The drive belt began its rapid cycle, slapping against its guides. Simmons was standing at his usual post, shouting orders over the din, oblivious to the physics equation Sarah had written in rope near his head. The loose end of the cord, caught by the friction of the racing belt, was snatched up instantly. The slack snapped tight in a millisecond. The tension didn't break the rope, it shattered the wooden support beam Sarah had anchored it to. A jagged splinter of timber, 3 feet long and heavy as iron, whipped around with the momentum of the belt and struck Simmons in the temple. The blow was so severe it lifted him off his feet and threw him into the sorting mechanism. By the time the workers managed to disengage the wheel, Simmons was dead, his neck broken by the impact. The official investigation cited a catastrophic structural failure caused by the machine's vibration. It was recorded as an industrial accident, another casualty of the Industrial Revolution's bloody march. That evening, as the twins cleared the dinner plates in the main house, they listened to William Hutchkins lament his misfortune. 3 men in 3 months, he murmured to his wife, staring into his wineglass. It feels as if the land itself has turned against us. He did not know how right he was. The death of Harold Simmons marked a transition in the twins' methodology. They realized that the chaotic environment of the plantation, filled with heavy animals, dangerous tools, and moving machinery, was a weapon waiting to be wielded. However, they also possessed an instinct for preservation that exceeded their years. 3 deaths in rapid succession had created a localized atmosphere of dread. To continue at such a pace would invite scrutiny that not even their invisibility could deflect. Sarah and Margaret initiated a summer of silence. For the next several months, they killed no one. They simply watched, served, and let the paranoia on the plantation fester. During this hiatus, the twins expanded their surveillance network. On Sundays, accompanying Martha Crane to the services in Waynesboro, they observed the broader tapestry of Burke County's slaveholding society. They watched the interactions between landowners, the gossip of the overseers gathered by the stables, and the silent exchanges of the enslaved from other properties. They began to understand that Hutchkins Fields was just one node in a larger system of oppression. They catalogued faces, memorized names, and noted which men carried themselves with the swagger of cruelty. Back at the plantation, the pause in deaths lulled the administration into a false sense of security. William Hutchkins hired replacements, younger men, eager to prove themselves, unaware that they were stepping into a graveyard. Among them were George Whitfield, who took over the gin house, and Charles Drummond, a new field supervisor. The twins watched them arrive with the dispassionate gaze of undertakers measuring clients for coffins. By September 1851, the heat had broken, and the harvest was in full swing. George Whitfield, anxious to exceed the quotas set by his predecessor, spent 16 hours a day in the gin house. He was not a physically violent man, but his negligence was lethal. He forced sick workers to man the machines, resulting in 2 severed fingers among the crew in his first month. The twins decided he had earned his place on the list. This time, they eschewed the immediate violence of ropes or traps for something more insidious. Sarah discovered a loose joint in the ventilation ducting that carried the worst of the cotton dust out of the building. Over the course of a week, during her water runs, she subtly manipulated the damper, reversing the airflow so that the heaviest particulate matter concentrated directly in the small office enclosure where Whitfield tallied the bales. It was a biological attack. Whitfield began to cough in mid-September. By October, he was hacking up blood and fibrous phlegm. He died on November 3rd, his lungs solidified by what the local doctor called acute respiratory congestion, a known hazard of the trade. It was a murder committed with dust and patience. Charles Drummond followed shortly after, in late November. Drummond was a brute of the old school, a man who believed that fear was the only currency the enslaved understood. He was inspecting a wagon loaded with 500 pounds of cotton bales near the storage barn. The wagon sat on a slight incline, held in place by a mechanical handbrake lever. The twins had identified Drummond's inspection routine weeks earlier. Margaret, small enough to crawl beneath the wagon frame unseen during the lunch hour, had located the iron pin that secured the brake assembly. She didn't remove it, that would be sabotage. Instead, she applied a corrosive acid mixture, derived from cleaning supplies in the laundry, to the metal retaining clip. It weakened the steel just enough to hold for a time but fail under vibration. As Drummond walked behind the wagon to check the rear axle, a worker tossed a final bale onto the bed. The impact shuddered through the frame. The corroded clip snapped, and the brake released. The wagon rolled backward silently, crushing Drummond against the barn wall before he could even scream. His chest was flattened. The verdict: mechanical failure due to rust. By the winter of 1852, the death toll stood at 5 men in 8 months. William Hutchkins was no longer just concerned. He was deeply, deeply unsettled. He stood in his study, staring at the names in his ledger, trying to find a pattern in the chaos. Statistically, it was improbable, but not impossible. Every investigation by Sheriff Morgan had been thorough, and every conclusion had been accidental. There were no knife wounds, no poisons, no strangulation marks. Just mud, gravity, dust, and rust. Hutchkins began to wonder if the slaves were right, if there was a curse on his land. This superstition worked in the twins' favor. The surviving overseers became jumpy, less prone to random acts of violence, terrified that the bad luck would target them next. The twins saw this shift and recognized their power. They were not just killing men, they were altering the behavior of the entire plantation through terror. The 6th name on their list was Arnold Fletcher, a field supervisor who had taken over the eastern sector. Fletcher was a man who hated the cold, and the winter of 1852 was exceptionally wet and frigid. He wore heavy wool coats and rode a mare that was skittish in the water. Fletcher had a habit of crossing a small tributary creek at a specific ford to save 20 minutes on his rounds. The creek was usually shallow, but the February rains had swollen it to the banks. Fletcher was a harsh man, known for using the lash on women who stopped to tend to their children in the rows. The twins decided he would not see the spring. They visited the creek ford during a heavy rainstorm, undetected in the downpour. Using a stolen spade and a pry bar, they did not sabotage a bridge. They sabotaged the riverbed itself. Working in the freezing water, Sarah and Margaret located the submerged ridge of rock that horses used for footing. They pried a large stone loose, creating a sudden, steep drop-off in the center of the ford, a hidden pothole 3 feet deep, masked by the rushing, muddy water. It was a trap that utilized the landscape itself. On the morning of February 18th, Fletcher rode his mare into the swollen creek. The horse, trusting the footing it had used 100 times, stepped into the void. The animal panicked, plunging shoulder deep into the current and bucking violently. Fletcher, encumbered by his heavy wool coat and stiff with cold, was thrown into the churning water. The coat soaked up the water instantly, acting like an anchor. He was swept downstream, his boots filling with silt, and drowned 300 yards from where the twins had watched him enter the water. The horse swam to shore and survived. Sheriff Morgan ruled it a drowning caused by the unpredictable currents of a winter storm. As the first anniversary of their campaign approached, Sarah and Margaret turned 13. They had eliminated 6 men. They had grown taller, their faces losing the last traces of childhood softness, replaced by a mask of serene, terrifying competence. They lay in their shared cot, listening to the breathing of the other sleepers in the kitchen quarters, communicating in the silent language of glances and touches. They knew the easy kills were done. The plantation was on high alert, the owners were suspicious of shadows, and the environment was saturated with fear. But they also knew that a new overseer was arriving, a man named James Pritchard, the brother of the second man they had killed. He was coming not just to work, but to ask questions. The twins understood that the game was about to change. They could no longer rely solely on the machinery of accidents. They would soon have to defend their work against a mind that was actively hunting them. The silent machinery of death they had built was humming perfectly, but the noise was beginning to attract attention. The arrival of James Pritchard in May of 1852 introduced a variable the twins had not previously encountered, a man motivated by suspicion rather than profit. James was the younger brother of Douglas Pritchard, the overseer who had died in the stirrup of a bolting horse a year prior. He did not come to Hutchkins Fields merely to manage the cotton harvest. He came to perform an autopsy on the past. He was a lean, hawk-faced man with eyes that constantly scanned the perimeter, looking for the wire behind the curtain. He openly questioned the official narratives. He spent his evenings not in the overseer's cabin drinking whiskey, but retracing the steps of the dead. He examined the site where Cushing had drowned, probing the mud with a cane. He inspected the cotton gin where Simmons had been crushed, asking pointed questions about belt tension and structural rot. Most dangerously, he began to notice the twins. He observed that Sarah and Margaret were often present in the background of these locations, silent and industrious, like fixtures of the landscape that had witnessed every tragedy. Pritchard began to document his findings. He wrote letters to his wife in South Carolina, detailing a theory that was slowly crystallizing in his mind, that the string of fatalities was the work of a saboteur. He had not yet identified the twins as the architects, but he was narrowing the field of suspects to those with unrestricted access to the grounds. The twins, through their network of eavesdropping in the main house, realized that Pritchard was becoming an existential threat. He wasn't just a cruel man to be punished. He was a hunter who was picking up their scent. They could not use a simple accident this time. Accidents invited inspection, and Pritchard was already inspecting everything. They needed an erasure. They needed an event so destructive that it would consume not just the man, but the evidence of his investigation. They turned their eyes toward the stables where Pritchard slept in a room adjacent to the tack storage, surrounded by dry hay, oiled leather, and timber seasoned by decades of Georgia sun. On the night of May 9th, 1852, just after midnight, the twins slipped into the stable block. They did not use a lantern. They navigated by the memory of touch. They located the tack room, where barrels of neatsfoot oil and turpentine were stored for equipment maintenance. They did not pour the accelerant randomly. Sarah saturated a pile of burlap sacks and positioned them at the base of the wooden partition that separated the storage area from Pritchard's sleeping quarters. Margaret constructed a candle clock, a simple wax candle set in a bed of dry straw and oil-soaked rags. They lit the wick, calculated to burn down to the flashpoint in 20 minutes, giving them ample time to return to the kitchen quarters and feign sleep. It was a crude timed device, but effective. When the candle flame finally touched the oil, the air in the tack room ignited with a whoomp that shook the rafters. The fire climbed the oil-soaked wood with voracious speed, turning the stable into a blast furnace before the alarm could even be raised. James Pritchard died of smoke inhalation before the flames even touched his skin, trapped in a room that had become a chimney. The fire consumed the stable entirely, reducing the structure and its contents to a heap of glowing charcoal and twisted iron. But the twins had made a miscalculation. Pritchard's letters, The documentation of his suspicions had not been in the stable. They had been mailed 2 days prior. When Pritchard's widow received the news of the fire, she brought the letters to the authorities demanding justice. She claimed her husband had been murdered to silence his investigation. This accusation forced the hand of Sheriff Clayton Morgan. He could no longer dismiss the events at Hutchkins Fields as bad luck. He arrived on May 24th with a mandate to turn the plantation upside down. It was the most dangerous moment the twins had yet faced. They were lined up with the rest of the household staff, two small figures in calico dresses, watching as the law descended upon their world. Sheriff Morgan was a practical man, not prone to flights of fancy, but the statistical anomaly of 7 deaths in 14 months sat heavy in his gut. He interviewed every soul on the property. When he questioned Sarah and Margaret, he did so in the presence of Martha Crane. The twins were the picture of terrified obedience. They spoke in soft, deferential tones, admitting they had been near the accident sites because their duties required them to carry water and food across the entire property. They widened their eyes when asked about sabotage, feigning ignorance of the very concept. Morgan looked at them, 13 years old, barely 5 feet tall, hands calloused from scrubbing floors, and his imagination failed him. He could not bridge the gap between these children and the monstrous precision required to execute 7 men. He noted their presence in his files but marked them as witnesses rather than suspects. He concluded that while the fire was suspicious, there was no physical proof of arson. The verdict was undetermined, but Morgan privately advised William Hutchkins to purge his staff and rotate his overseers. The investigation scared William Hutchkins into action. He implemented a rotation of supervisors, bringing in strangers from other counties, breaking the patterns the twins had spent months memorizing. The plantation became a fortress of scrutiny. Sarah and Margaret realized that killing at home was no longer viable. The eyes of the administration were too sharp. However, the crisis created a new opportunity. Desperate to prove that Hutchkins Fields was still a civilized place, Elena Hutchkins threw herself into a campaign of aggressive philanthropy. She began organizing charitable visits to other plantations, delivering blankets, medicine, and Bibles to the enslaved communities of Burke County. She took the twins with her as assistants, parading them as examples of her well-trained household. For Sarah and Margaret, this was not charity. It was a reconnaissance mission. They were being hand-delivered to new hunting grounds, transported by carriage into the heart of rival plantations, where the overseers did not know to fear the quiet twins in the background. Between October 1852 and March 1853, the twins expanded their kill zone. They accompanied Elena to 5 different plantations, moving through these new environments with the heightened senses of spies behind enemy lines. They had to work faster now, without the luxury of weeks of observation. They learned to assess structural weaknesses and routine vulnerabilities in a matter of hours. During a visit to the Red Creek estate, they noticed an overseer who drank heavily during his lunch hour near an irrigation pond. On their next visit, a well-timed shove while he was stuporous sent him into the water. He was too intoxicated to swim. At another property, they weakened the support strut of a tool shed roof that was already sagging under the weight of winter debris. It collapsed 2 days later, crushing a driver who had taken shelter from the rain. These deaths were scattered, geographically distinct, and attributed to the general hazards of plantation life. Sheriff Morgan saw the reports but failed to connect the dots, blinded by the distance between the incidents. But the twins were becoming overconfident. The rush of the kill, the feeling of godlike power over the men who claimed to own them, was beginning to erode their caution. In April 1853, they targeted Richard Blackwell at the Fairview Plantation, 8 miles from Hutchkins Fields. Blackwell was a monster of a man, infamous for branding runaways. The twins, during a charity visit, had located his office, a detached wooden structure where he kept his whips and ledgers. They planned a repeat of the Pritchard maneuver, a delayed fire set to ignite while they were miles away, establishing an ironclad alibi. They prepared the materials during a delivery of medical supplies, hiding a cache of oil and kindling beneath the crawl space of his office, intending to return under the cover of night to light the fuse. It was a plan that relied on Blackwell's rigid adherence to his schedule of sleeping in the main house. On the night of April 3rd, the twins snuck away from Hutchkins Fields and ran the 8 miles to Fairview. It was a grueling journey, but they moved with the endurance of marathon runners. They reached Blackwell's office at 2:30 a.m., retrieved their materials, and set the fire. The flames caught quickly, licking up the dry clapboard siding. But they had made a fatal error in intelligence gathering. Blackwell had argued with the plantation owner that evening and had been banished to sleep in his office. He was not absent, he was inside, dozing lightly on a cot. The crackle of the flames woke him instantly. He burst out of the burning building, coughing and singed, but alive. As he stumbled into the yard, gasping for air, he looked toward the tree line. The moon was full, casting a stark, blue-white illumination across the clearing. There, for a split second before they vanished into the woods, Blackwell saw them. He did not see faces, but he saw the silhouette. Two small figures, identical in height, moving with a strange, synchronized gait, running side by side as if tethered together. He told the sheriff the next morning that it looked like two children, or perhaps spirits, running as one. When Sheriff Morgan heard the description, two small figures, the tumblers in his mind finally clicked into place. He looked at his map of accidents. He looked at the schedule of Elanina Hutchkins's charity visits. He looked at the file on the stable fire that killed James Pritchard. The impossibility of it began to dissolve. The bad luck wasn't a cloud hanging over the county, it was a contagion, and the carriers were Sarah and Margaret. Morgan realized with a sickening jolt that he had looked into the eyes of the killers months ago and let them walk away. He sat at his desk, the Blackwell report shaking in his hand, and prepared to ride to Hutchkins Fields one last time. The hunt was no longer for ghosts, it was for two 13-year-old girls. Sheriff Clayton Morgan rode back onto the grounds of Hutchkins Fields on May 15, 1853, carrying the weight of a revelation that terrified him. The disparate threads of the last 2 years, the drowned men, the crushed bodies, the convenient fires, had woven themselves into a tapestry that depicted two 13-year-old girls as the most prolific killers in the history of Georgia. He met with William Hutchkins in the plantation study, a room now thick with the stale air of decline. Morgan did not mince words. He laid out the timeline, the correlation between the twins' presence and the accidents, and the damning testimony from Fairview. "I am not suggesting your property is cursed, Mr. Hutchkins," Morgan said, his voice low and grave. "I am suggesting that you have been harboring a nest of vipers." Hutchkins, pale and shaking, tried to argue the absurdity of it. Children, mere girls. But the sheriff's certainty was a stone wall. They agreed to a formal interrogation scheduled for May 22nd, a delay necessitated by the legal complexities of accusing enslaved minors of capital crimes against white citizens. The twins did not need to be told that the end had arrived. They possessed an uncanny ability to read the atmosphere of the main house, to interpret the hushed conversations and the sudden, fearful glances from the staff. They understood that the protective veil of their childhood had finally shredded. The interrogation would not be a conversation. It would be a trap, and they had no intention of walking into it. They spent the week preparing with the same meticulous attention to detail they had applied to their murders. They cached food supplies in a hollow tree near the northern boundary. They sharpened a kitchen knife on a whetstone until the edge could shave hair. They studied the patrol schedules of the county slave catchers. They decided on the night of May 20th, 2 days before the interrogation, as their departure date. It was a moonless night, offering the cloak of absolute darkness they required. When the evening meal service concluded, Sarah and Margaret slipped from the kitchen quarters carrying a basket of linens. It was a common enough sight, servants taking soiled cloths to the washhouse, but their destination was the perimeter fence. They moved like smoke, soundless and fluid, heading toward the northern tree line. They had traveled less than a mile when the variable they hadn't calculated appeared on the path. Robert Crane, the head overseer who had survived the purge of his colleagues by virtue of his competence and relative restraint, was walking the perimeter with a lantern. He was a vigilant man, the only one who had ever truly looked at the twins and seen the intelligence behind the mask. When his lantern light swung across the path and illuminated the two small figures, he didn't shout, he simply stopped, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. "Sarah! Margaret!" he asked, his voice cutting through the hum of the cicadas. "You are far from your quarters." The twins stopped. There was no panic, no trembling. They simply stood side by side, their hands empty, their faces illuminated by the flickering oil lamp. Crane took a step forward, the lantern swinging, and in that shifting light he saw it. He saw the travel clothes beneath the aprons. He saw the tension in their posture. And finally, looking into their eyes, he saw the abyss that Sheriff Morgan had tried to describe. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was them. "It was you," Crane whispered, the pieces of 2 years of tragedy locking together in his mind. All of them. Vernon, Douglas, it was you. He reached for the knife at his belt, not out of aggression, but out of a sudden primal fear of these children. But the twins were already moving. They did not flee. They attacked. Margaret dropped the linen basket, revealing the heavy river stone she had palmed. Sarah lunged low, aiming for his knees. Crane was a large man, strong and experienced in violence, but he was fighting shadows that didn't follow the rules of combat. Sarah's impact threw him off balance, and as he stumbled, Margaret struck. She brought the stone down on his lantern hand with bone-shattering force. The lantern fell, smashing against the hard-packed earth. The glass shattered and the oil spilled, igniting instantly in the dry grass. Darkness rushed in, broken only by the spreading flames. In the confusion, Crane tried to regain his footing, but the twins were a whirlwind of coordinated strikes. They didn't have the strength to overpower him, so they used the environment. As Crane lunged for Sarah, Margaret tripped him. He fell hard, his temple striking the same rock Margaret had used as a weapon. He went limp, stunned into unconsciousness, blood pooling on the path. The fire from the lantern was growing, licking at the dry scrub, hungry for fuel. The twins stood over the unconscious overseer, their chests heaving, illuminated by the growing inferno. This was the crossroads. They could run and leave him to wake up and raise the alarm, or they could finish the work. They did not speak. They simply grabbed Crane by his coat collar and boots. He was heavy, dead weight, but they dragged him 3 feet, positioning his body directly in the path of the spreading flames. It would look like another accident, a man who tripped, hit his head, and was consumed by his own lantern fire. It was the signature they had perfected, death that looked like misfortune. As the fire caught Crane's clothing, the twins turned their backs on Hutchkins Fields for the last time. They melted into the forest, leaving behind the blaze that would serve as both their exit signal and the funeral pyre for the last man standing in their way. Sheriff Morgan found the body at dawn. The fire had been contained by the field hands, but Robert Crane was unrecognizable. Yet, Morgan knew. He stood over the charred remains, the smell of burnt grass and flesh in his nostrils, and he felt a cold admiration for the absolute ruthlessness of the escape. "They are gone," he told the search party, "and they have a 12-hour lead." Morgan organized the pursuit with frantic energy, assuming the twins would head east toward the Savannah River to cross into South Carolina, the traditional route for runaways. He deployed dogs and men along the riverbanks, sealing the border. But the twins had anticipated this. In a damp cave 10 miles north, they had held a council of war. Sarah argued that the river was a trap. "They expect us to run to the water," she whispered. "We go north, to Augusta. We hide in the crowd." The journey to Augusta was a 3-day ordeal of hunger and evasion. They moved only at night, navigating by the stars, sleeping in drainage ditches and dense thickets during the day. They ate raw corn stolen from fields and drank from muddy creeks. On May 24th, they reached the outskirts of the city. Augusta was a chaotic hub of commerce, filled with wagons, riverboats, and a transient population that offered anonymity. But the twins knew that 2 identical faces were a liability. They were memorable. Together they were a spectacle. Apart, they were just invisible servant girls. In a small grove of oak trees south of the city, they made the pact that would sever the bond they had shared since the womb. They would separate. They would assume new names. They would never contact each other again until it was safe, a timeline they left undefined. There were no tears. They embraced once, a fierce, silent clutching of hands, and then walked away in opposite directions, Sarah toward the textile mills, Margaret toward the domestic quarters of the city. Sheriff Morgan tracked them to the city limits but found the trail cold. He spent weeks interviewing dock workers and merchants, chasing phantom sightings of twin girls, but they had vanished. The investigation at Hutchkins Fields was formally closed in August 1853. The final report was a document of failure, admitting that Sarah and Margaret, property of William Hutchkins, were the likely perpetrators of 11 murders but were currently fugitives from justice. The plantation never recovered. William Hutchkins, broken by the scandal and financial ruin, sold the land in 1854. The story of the murdering twins became a dark legend in Burke County, a bedtime story told to scare overseers. Morgan remained sheriff until the Civil War, haunted by the case, keeping a file on his desk that he opened on sleepless nights, wondering where the monsters had gone. 14 years later, in 1867, a letter arrived at the sheriff's office in Waynesboro. It was postmarked from Philadelphia, written in an elegant, practiced hand that Morgan did not recognize. It was unsigned. The text was brief. "We survived. We built new lives. We never killed again, for it was never about the killing. It was about the balance. We were not evil, Sheriff. We were the consequences of your world. Do not look for us. We are gone." Morgan read the letter until the paper wore thin. He never showed it to anyone. He died in 1872, taking the secret of the letter to his grave. Historians would later find a Sarah Hutchinson listed as a seamstress in Philadelphia records and a Margaret Hutchinson in Boston, both women living quiet, solitary lives, dying of old age in the early 20th century. The truth of what happened in Burke County remains suspended in the amber of history, a narrative constructed from court records, grave markers, and whispered folklore. Did two 13-year-old girls truly possess the capacity to wage a guerrilla war against an entire plantation system? Or were they simply convenient scapegoats for a series of tragedies that a superstitious community couldn't explain? The evidence suggests the former, that for 26 months, the impossible happened. Sarah and Margaret proved that the powerless are only powerless until they refuse to be. They stand in the shadows of American history, not as victims, but as the architects of their own terrifying justice, watching us across the centuries with eyes that hold no fear, no guilt, and no mercy whatsoever. The ledgers are closed, the cotton fields are overgrown, but the question they posed remains. What are you capable of when survival is the only law that matters?